Chapter 2. India. Let us first of all consider the conception of deity which was formed by these ancestors, simultaneously with the Egyptians, or, as is much more probable, before them. Their traditions may lay claim to at least 5,000 or 6,000 years, and they themselves received these traditions from peoples who today have disappeared, their last trace in the memory of them and dating back, according to Timaeus and the Critias of Plato, 120 centuries. I must apologize to the reader for the inextricable nomenclature of Oriental mythology and the multiplicity of those anthropomorphic divinities whom the priests of India, like those of Egypt and of Persia, and indeed of all times and countries, were compelled to create in order to satisfy the demands of popular idolatry. I shall also spare him the ostentation of a facile scholarship, lavish of unpronounceable names, in order at once to proceed to and consider only the essential conception of the first cause, as we find it in the remotest, which, if not withheld from the common people, ceased gradually to be understood by them, until it became of the elect among the priests and initiates. Let us at once give ear to the Rig-Veda, the most authentic echo of the most immemorial traditions. Let us note how it approaches the formidable problem. There was neither being nor non-being. There was neither atmosphere nor heavens above the atmosphere. What moved and whither? And in whose care? Were there waters, and the bottomless deep? There was then neither death nor immortality. The day was not divided from the night. Only the one breathed, in himself, without extraneous breath, and apart from him there was nothing. Then for the first time desire awoke within him. This was the first seed of the spirit. The sages, full of understanding, striving within their hearts, discovered in non-being the link with being. Who knoweth and who can tell where creation was born, whence it came, and whether the gods were not born afterwards? Who knoweth whence it hath come? Whence this creation hath come, whether it be created or uncreated? He whose eye watches over it from the highest heaven, he alone knoweth. And yet doth he know? Is it possible to find, in our human annals, words more majestic, more full of solemn anguish, more august in tone, more devout, more terrible? Where could we find at the very foundation of life a completer and more irreducible confession of ignorance? Where, from the depths of our agnosticism, which thousands of years have augmented, can we point to a wider horizon? At the very outset it surpasses all that has been said, and goes farther than we shall ever dare to go, lest we fall into despair. For it does not fear to ask itself whether the Supreme Being knows what he has done, knows whether he is or is not the Creator, and questions whether he has become conscious of himself. Now let us hear the Sama-Veda, confirming and elucidating this magnificent confession of ignorance. If thou sayest, I have perfect knowledge of the Supreme Being, thou deceivest thyself, for who shall number his attributes? If thou sayest, I think I know him, I do not think I know him perfectly, nor that I do not know him at all, but I know him in part. For he who knows all the manifestations of the gods who proceed from him knows the Supreme Being. If thou sayest this, thou deceivest thyself, for not to be wholly ignorant of him is not to know him. He, on the contrary, who believes that he does not know him, is he that does know him. And he who believes that he knows him is he that does not know him. Those who know him best regard him as incomprehensible, and those who know nothing at all of him believe that they know him perfectly. To this fundamental agnosticism, the Rig-Veda brings its absolute pantheism. The sage fixes his eyes upon this mysterious being in whom the universe perpetually exists, for it has no other foundation. In him this world is contained. It is from him that this world has issued. He is entwined and inwoven in all created things, under all the varied forms of life. This sole being, to whom nothing can attain, is swifter than thought, and the gods themselves cannot comprehend this supreme mover who has preceded them all. He is remote from all things and close at hand. He fills the entire universe, yet infinitely surpasses it. When man has learned to behold all creatures in this supreme spirit, and his supreme spirit in all his creatures, he can no longer despise anything whatsoever. Those who refuse to believe in the identity of all created things have fallen into a profound darkness. Those who believe only in their individual selves have fallen into a much profounder darkness. He who believes in the eternal identity of created beings wins immortality. All creatures exist in this supreme spirit, and this supreme spirit exists in all creatures. All creatures appear to him as they have been from all eternity, always resembling themselves. Our ancestors did their best thoroughly to examine this tremendous confession of ignorance, to people this abysmal void, in which man could not draw breath, and sought to define this supreme being, whom a tradition more prehistoric than themselves had not ventured to conceive. No spectacle could be more absorbing than this struggle of our forefathers of 5,000 to 10,000 years ago with the unknowable. And in order to convey some idea of this struggle, I shall borrow their own voices, reproducing only the almost despairing terms by which they expressed themselves in the most ancient and authentic of their sacred books, which we must read without allowing ourselves to be alarmed by that incoherence of the images employed which is, as Bergain remarks, the daily bread of Vedic poetry. God, they tell us, is being. He is all things, existing and in himself, unknowable, and the cause without a cause of all causes. He is infinitely ancient, infinitely unknown. He is all things and in all things, the eternal soul of all created beings, whom no one can comprehend. He is the unification of all material, intellectual, and moral forms of all existing beings. He is the sole primordial germ, undisclosed by all, the unknown deep, the uncreated substance of the unknown. No, no, is his name. And all things waver perpetually between all things are and nothing exists. The sea alone knows the depths of the sea. Space alone knows the extent of space. God alone can know God. He contains all things, yet is unknown to all. He is non-existent because he is absolute being, that which is nothing while it is nevertheless all things. He who is, yet is not, the eternal cause that is non-existent, the undiscovered and the undiscoverable, whom no created being can understand, says Manu. He is no definite thing. He is no known or visible being, nor can we bestow upon him the name of any object. He is the secret of all secrets. He is it, the passive and latent element. The world is his name, his image, but it is only his former existence, which contains all things in itself, that is actually existent. This universe is he. It comes from him. It returns to him. All the worlds are one with him, for they exist only by his will. an everlasting will, inborn in all created things. This will is revealed in what we call the creation, preservation, and destruction of the universe. But there is no creation properly so called, for, since all things have from all time existed in him, creation is but an emanation of that which is in him. This emanation merely renders visible to our eyes what was not visible. Similarly, there is no such thing as destruction, this being but an inhalation of that which has been exhaled. And this inhalation, in its turn, does no more than render invisible that which was aforetime seen. For all things are indestructible, being merely the substance of the Supreme Being who himself has neither beginning nor end, whether in space or in time. To have explored thus profoundly and comprehensively, since what our ignorance calls the beginning, the infinite mystery of the unknowable first cause, must obviously presuppose a civilization, an accumulation of ideas and meditations, an experience, a degree of contemplation and a perception of the universe, which are well calculated to amaze and humiliate us. We are now barely regaining the heights whence these ideas have come down to us, ideas in which pantheism and monotheism are confounded, forming only a single complex in the incommensurable unknown. And who knows whether we could have recovered them without their aid? Less than a century ago we still knew nothing of these definitions in their original majesty and lucidity. But they had spread in all directions, and were floating like wreckage on the subterranean waters of all the religions, and above all on those of the official religion of Egypt, in which the new is as unknowable as the Hinduit, and in which, according to the occultist tradition, the supreme revelation at the close of the final initiation consisted of these terrible words, dropped casually into the ears of the adept. Osiris is a dark god. That is, a god who cannot be understood, who will never be understood. They were found, likewise, adrift in the Bible, or if not in the Vulgate, in which they become unrecognizable, at least in the versions of the Hebraisers, such as Faber de Livit, who have restored its actual meaning, or believe themselves to have done so. Fitfully, too, they showed beneath the mysteries of Greece, which were merely a pale and distorted reproduction of the Egyptian mysteries. They were visible, too, though nearer the surface, beneath the doctrines of the Essenes, who, according to Pliny, had lived for thousands of centuries by the shores of the Dead Sea. Per saculorum millia, which is obviously exaggerated. They drifted through the Kabbalah, the tradition of the ancient Hebrew initiates, who claimed to have preserved the oral law which God gave to Moses on Sinai and which, passing from mouth to mouth, were written down by the learned rabbis of the Middle Ages. They might be glimpsed behind the extraordinary doctrines and dreams of the Gnostics, the probable heirs of the undiscoverable Essenes, beneath the teachings of the Neoplatonists and those of the early Christians. As in the darkness in which the unhappy medieval Hermetics lost their way, amid texts which bear the marks of an ever-increasing mutilation and corruption, following gleams of light that grew more and more perilous and uncertain. Here, then, is a great truth, the first of all truths, the fundamental truth that lies at the root of things, to which we have now returned. The unknowable nature of the causeless cause of all causes. But of this cause, or this God, we should never have known anything had he remained self-absorbed, had he never manifested himself. It was necessary that he should emerge from his inactivity, which for us was equivalent to nothingness, since the universe seems to exist, and we ourselves believe that we live in him. freed from the creeper-like entanglements of the theogonic and theological theories that quickly invaded it on every hand. The first cause, or rather the eternal cause for having no beginning, it can be neither first nor second, has never created anything. There was no creation, since all has existed within this cause, from all eternity, in a form invisible to our eyes, but more real than it could be if they beheld it, since our eyes are so fashioned as to behold illusions only. From the point of view of this illusion, this all, that exists always, appears or disappears in accordance with an eternal rhythm beaten out by the sleeping and waking of the eternal cause. Thus it is, say the laws of Manu, that by an alternation of awakening and repose the immutable being causes all this assemblage of creatures, mobile and immobile, eternally to return to life and to die. He exhales himself, or expels his breath, and spirit descends into matter, which is only a visible form of spirit. And throughout the universe innumerable worlds are born, multiply and evolve. He himself inhales, indrawing his breath, and matter enters into spirit, which is but an invisible form of matter. And the worlds disappear, without perishing, to reintegrate the eternal cause, and emerge once more upon the awakening of Brahma, that is, thousands of millions of years later, to enter into him again when he sleeps once more, after thousands of millions of years. And so it has been and ever shall be, through all eternity, without beginning, without cessation, and without end. Here again we have a tremendous confession of ignorance. And this new confession, the oldest of all, however far back we go, is also the most profound, the most complete, and the most impressive. This explanation of the incomprehensible universe, which explains nothing, since one cannot explain the inexplicable, is more acceptable than any other that we could offer, and is perhaps the only one that we could accept without stumbling at every step over insurmountable objections and questions to which our reason gives no reply. This second admission we find at the origin of the two mother faiths. In Egypt, even in the superficial and exoteric Egypt, which is all that we know, and without taking into account the secret meaning which probably underlies the hieroglyphs, it assumes a similar form. Here, too, there is no creation properly so called, but the externalization of a latent and everlasting spiritual principle. All beings and all things exist from all eternity in the new and return thither after death. The new is the deep of Genesis. A divine spirit hovers above it vaguely, bearing within it the total sum of future existences. Whence its name, Turn, whose meaning is at once nothingness and totality. When Turn wished to create within his heart all that exists, he rose up amid what things were present in the new, outside the new, and all lifeless things, and the sun, Ra, was, and there was light. But there were not three gods, the deep, the spirit in the deep, and light without the deep. Turn, exteriorized by virtue of his creative desire, became Ra the sun god, without ceasing to be Turn and without ceasing to be new. He says of himself, I am Turn. I am that which existed alone in the abyss. I am the great God, self-created. That is, I am new, the father of the gods. He is the total sum of the lives of all created beings. And to express the idea that the demiurge has created all things of his own essence, the famous Leiden papyrus explains, there was no other God before him, nor any beside him. When he decreed his likeness, there was no mother for him, who was self-named. In Egyptian, naming is equivalent to creating. No father for him who uttered this name, saying, "It is I who have created thee." In order to create, the Egyptian first thinks and then utters the world. Here already is the word, the famous logos of the Alexandrian philosophers, which we shall encounter again later on. His supreme intelligence assumes the name of Ptah. His heart, which is the spirit that moves him, is Horus, and the word, the instrument of creation, is Thoth. Thus we have Ptah, Horus, Thoth, the creator spirit word, the Trinity in unity of turn. Subsequently, as in the Vedic, Persian, and Chaldean religions, the supreme and unknowable deity was gradually relegated to oblivion, and we hear only of his innumerable emanations, whose names vary from century to century and occasionally from city to city. Thus, in the Book of the Dead, Osiris, who becomes the best-known god of Egypt, states that he is Turn. In Mazdaism, or Zoroastrianism, which is merely an adaptation of Vedism to the Iranian temperament, the supreme deity is not the omnipotent creator who could fashion the world as he desired. He is subject to the inflexible laws of the unknown first cause, which is perhaps himself. In Chaldea, that crossroads where the religions of India, Egypt, and Persia meet, matter self-existent and still uncreated, gives birth to all things. Not creating because all things have their being in it, but manifesting itself periodically, when its image is reflected in the world visible to our eyes. In the Kabbalah, the last echo, the blurred copy of the esoteric doctrines of Chaldea and Egypt, we find the same confusion. The eternal spirit, increate and unknowable, not understood in its pure essence, contains in itself the principle of all that exists, manifesting itself and becoming visible to man only by its emanations. Lastly, if we open the Bible, not its restricted, superficial, and empirical translation, but a version which goes to the heart of the inner meaning, essential and radical, of the Hebrew words such as that which Faber delivered attempted, we find, in the first verse of Genesis, in the first beginning, which is to say before all, he, Elohim, God of gods, the existing being, created, which does not mean made something out of nothing, but drew from an unknown element, caused to pass from its principle to its essence, the very self of the heavens and the very self of earth. And the earth existed, a contingent power of being in the dominion of being, and the darkness, a compressive and indurating force, was over the face of the deep, the universal and contingent power of being. And the breath of the God of gods, an expansive and dilating force, moved with generative power upon the face of the waters, universal passivity. Is it not interesting to note that this literal translation brings us very close to India, to the idea of the unknown origin, and closer still to the Hindu creation? The passing from principle to essence, the expansion of the being of beings who contains all things, and of the externalization, upon his awakening, of the power that was latent within him during his sleep. Let us remember that in 1875 Max Miller wrote, 50 years ago there was not a single scholar who could translate a line of the Veda. We must therefore believe, despite the assertion of the great Orientalist, either that Faber de Livit was capable of translating it, or that he had divined the spirit of it in the traditions of the Kabbalah, which he could not have known save for the very incomplete and inaccurate Kabbalah Denudata of Rosenroth. Whilst that the Hebrew text, if it really says what he makes it say, as everything seems to prove, reproduces the Hindu sources in a singular fashion. For his translation, the fruit of long previous labors, appeared in 1815. That is, 10 or 20 years before anyone had learned to read Sanskrit and the Egyptian hieroglyphs. Is it possible today, with all that we believe we know, or rather with all that we have at last realized that we do not know, to give a more comprehensive, more profoundly negative idea of divinity than that conveyed by these religions at the beginnings of the human race, or one that corresponds more closely with the vast and hopeless ignorance which will always characterize our discussions as to the first cause? Do we not find ourselves now at an enormous height above the more or less anthropomorphic gods that followed the supreme unknowable of that religion which was the misappreciated mother of all the rest? Is it not to her nameless enigma that we are returning at long last, after all our protracted wanderings? After wasting so much energy and so many centuries, after committing so many errors, so many crimes, in seeking for her where she was not, far from the aboriginal summits on which she has awaited us for so many thousands and thousands of years. But this admission of ignorance had to be embellished and peopled. The fathomless gulf had to be filled. An abstraction which surpassed the bounds of understanding, with which mankind could never be content, had to be quickened into life. And this all religions endeavored to accomplish, beginning with that one which first made the venture. Once more I brush aside the brambles of the theogonies, simple at their origin but soon inextricable, to follow the broad outlines. In the primitive religion, as we have already seen, the unknown cause, at a given moment of the infinity of time, beginning once more what it has done from all eternity, awakes, divides itself, becomes objective, is reflected in the universal passivity, and becomes, until its approaching slumber, our visible universe. Of this unknown self-existent cause which divides itself into two parts, to render visible that which was latent in it, are born Brahma or Nara, the Father, and Nari, the universal Mother, of whom is born in his turn Viraj, the Son, the universe. This primitive triad, assuming a more anthropomorphic form, becomes Brahma, the creator, Vishnu, the preserver, and Shiva, the destroyer and regenerator. In Egypt we have Nu, Turn, and Ra. Then Ptah, Horus, and Thoth, who then became Osiris, Isis, and Horus. After these first subdivisions of the unknown cause, the primeval pantheons are filled by the serried hosts of gods who are merely intermittent emanations, transitory representatives, ephemeral offshoots of the first cause, personifications, more and more human, of its manifestations, its purposes, its attributes or powers. We need not examine these here, but it is interesting to note, in passing, the profound truths which these immemorial cosmogonies and theogonies almost always discover, and which are gradually being confirmed by science. Was it, for example, mere chance that decreed that the earth should proceed from chaos, take shape and be covered with life precisely in the order which they describe? According to the laws of Manu, the ether engenders the atmosphere. The atmosphere, transforming itself, engenders light. The atmosphere and light, giving rise to heat, produce water. And water is the mother of all living creatures. When this world had emerged from the darkness, says the Bhagavata Purana, which according to the Hindus is contemporary with the Veda, The subtle elementary principle produced the vegetable seed which first of all gave life to the plants. From the plants life passed into the fantastic creatures which were born of the slime in the waters. Then, through a series of different shapes and animals, it came to man. They passed in succession by way of the plants, the worms, the insects, the serpents, the tortoises, cattle, and the wild animals. Such is the lower stage, says Manu again, who adds, creatures acquired the qualities of those that preceded them, so that the farther down its position in the series, the greater its qualities. 1. Have we not here the whole of Darwinian evolution confirmed by geology and foreseen at least 6,000 years ago? On the other hand, is not this the theory of the Akasa, which we more clumsily call the ether, the sole source of all substances, to which our physical science is returning? One might give an infinite number of these disquieting examples. Whence did our prehistoric ancestors, in their supposedly terrible state of ignorance and abandonment, derive those extraordinary intuitions, that knowledge and assurance which we ourselves are scarcely reconquering? And if their ideas were correct upon certain points which we are able by chance to verify, have we not reason to ask ourselves whether they may not have seen matters more correctly and farther ahead than we did in respect of many other problems, as to which they are equally definite in their assertions, but which have hitherto been beyond our verification? One thing is certain, that to reach the stage at which they then stood they must have had behind them a treasury of traditions, observations, and experiences, in a word, of wisdom of which we find it difficult to form any conception, but in which, while waiting for something better, we ought to place rather more confidence than we have done, and by which we might well benefit, assuaging our fears and learning to understand and reassure ourselves in respect of our future beyond the tomb and guiding our lives. We have just seen that the primitive religions, and those which derive therefrom, are in agreement as to the eternally unknowable nature of the first cause, and that their explanations of the transition from non-being to being, from the passive to the active, and of the generative division which gives rise to the triad, are almost identical. Let us here note the strange defect of logic which dominates and spreads its shadow over the whole problem of religion. The mother religions, or rather the mother religion, tells us that the cause of causes is unknowable, that it is impossible to define, comprehend, or imagine it, that it is it and nothing more, that it is non-existence while it is yet preeminently and essentially being, eternal, infinite, occupying all time and space. Indeed, it is all time and space, having neither shape nor desire nor any particular attribute, since it has all. Now, from this unconditioned something, this absolute of the absolute, of which we cannot say what it is, and even less what it purposes of this, the very source of the undefinable and the unknowable, religion calls forth emanations which immediately become gods, perfectly comprehended, perfectly defined, acting very definitely in their respective spheres, manifesting a personal power and will, promulgating laws and a whole moral code with which man is enjoined to comply. How can entities so completely comprehended emerge from an entity essentially unknown? How, if the whole is unknowable, can a part of this whole suddenly become familiar? In this illimitable and inconceivable something, the only thing admissible, for it is to this that science is leading us back, where is the point whence the gods who have been imposed upon us emerge? Where is the link? Where the affinity? Where and at what moment was the incomprehensible miracle performed of the transubstantiation of the unknowable? Where is the transition which justifies this formidable change from unfathomable obscurity, not to the possible or the probable merely, but to the known, described even to its smallest details? Does it not seem as though the mother religion, and after it all the other faiths, which are but its offspring, more or less disguised, must have willfully split itself in two, or rather that it must have taken a stupendous and willfully blind leap into the gulf of unreason? Is it not possible that it has not dared to deduce all the consequences of its tremendous admission? And would it not, for that matter, have deduced the consequences elsewhere, and precisely in the secret doctrines whose traces we are still vainly seeking, and whose revelation sealed forever the lips of the great initiates? This suspicion, which will recur more than once as we probe more deeply into these religions, would explain the dread cry of occultist tradition, of which we have already spoken. Osiris is a dark god. Can it be that the great, supreme secret is absolute agnosticism? Without speaking of the esoteric doctrines, of which we are ignorant, have we not an all but public avowal in the word Maya, the most mysterious of Indian words, which means that all things, even the universe and the gods who create, uphold, and rule it, are but the illusion of ignorance, and that the uncreated and the unknowable alone are real? But what religion could proclaim to its faithful? We know nothing. We merely declare that this universe exists, or at least appears to our eyes to exist. Does it exist of itself? Is it itself a god, or is it but the effect of a remote cause? And behind this remote cause must we not suppose yet another and remoter cause, and so forth indefinitely, to the verge of madness? For if God is, who created God? Whether he is cause or effect matters little enough to our ignorance, which in any case remains irreducible. Its blind spots have merely been shifted. Traditions of great antiquity tell us that he is rather the manifestation of a cause even more inconceivable than himself. We accept this tradition, which is, perhaps, more inexplicable than the riddle itself as we perceive it, but which seems to take into account its apparently transitory or perishable elements, and to replace them by an eternal foundation, immutable and purely spiritual. Knowing absolutely nothing of this cause, we must confine ourselves to noting certain propensities, certain states of equilibrium, certain laws, which seem to be its will. Of these, for in the time being, we make gods. But these gods are merely personifications, perhaps accurate, perhaps illusory, perhaps erroneous, of what we believe ourselves to have observed. It is possible that other more accurate observations will dethrone them. It is possible that a day will come when we shall perceive that the unknown cause, in some respect a little less unknown, has had other intentions than those which we have attributed to it. We shall then change the names, the purposes, and the laws of our gods. But in the meantime, those whom we offer you are born of observations and experiences so wise and so ancient that hitherto none have been able to excel them. While it was impossible thus to address its faithful, who would not have understood its confession, it could safely reveal the secret to the last initiates, who had been prepared by protracted ordeals and whose intelligence was attested by a selection of inhuman severity. To certain of these, then, it admitted everything. It probably told them, in offering mankind our gods, we had no wish to deceive them. If we had confessed to them that God is unknown and incomprehensible, that we cannot say what he is or what he purposes, that he has neither shape nor substance nor dwelling place, neither beginning nor end, that he is everywhere and nowhere, that he is nothing because he is everything. They would have concluded that he does not exist at all, that neither laws nor duties have any existence, and that the universe is a vast abyss in which all should make haste to do as they please. Now, even if we know nothing, we know that this is not so and cannot be so. We know, in any case, that the cause of causes is not material, as men would understand it, for all matter appears to be perishable, and perishable it cannot be. For us, this unknown cause is actually our God, because our understanding is capable of perceiving it as having a scope which is limited only by our finite imagination. We know, with a certainty, that nothing has power to shake, that this cause, or the cause of this cause, and so forth indefinitely, must exist, although we are aware that we can never know it or understand it. But very few men are capable of convincing themselves of the existence of a thing which they can never hope to touch, feel, hear, know, or understand. This is why, instead of the nothingness which they would think that we were offering them were we to tell them how ignorant we are of all things, we offer them as their guide certain apparent traces of purpose which we believe ourselves to have detected in the darkness of time and space. This confession of absolute ignorance in respect of the first cause and the essential nature of the God of gods will be found likewise at the root of the Egyptian religion. But it is very probable that once it was lost to sight, for humanity does not care to linger in hopelessness and ignorance, it would have been necessary to repeat it to the initiates, to state it definitely, to emphasize it and to deduce its consequences. And, thus revealed in its entirety, it may have become the foundation of the secret doctrine. We find, in fact, that the makers of the subsequent theogonies were eager to forget the confession recorded on the first pages of the sacred books. They no longer took it into account. They thrust it back into the darkness of the beginning, the night of the incomprehensible. No longer was it discussed, for men concerned themselves now only with the gods who had issued from it, forgetting always to add that having emanated from the inexpressible unknown, they must necessarily, essentially and by definition, participate in its nature, and must be equally unknown and unknowable. It may therefore be the case that the secret doctrine reserved to the high priests led them to a more accurate conception of the primordial truth. The great secret, there was in all probability no need to add further explanations to this confession, since it destroys the very grounds of all possible explanations. What, for example, could the initiates be told on the subject of the first and most formidable of all enigmas, which is encountered immediately following that of the cause of causes, the origin of evil? The exoteric religions solved the riddle by dividing and multiplying their gods. This was a simple and easy procedure. There were gods of light who represented and did good, and there were gods of darkness who represented and did evil. They fought one another in all the worlds, and although the good gods were always the more powerful, they were never completely victorious in this world. We shall find the most definite types of this dualism in the mythology of the Avesta, in which they take the names of Ormuz and Ahriman, but by other names, and in other shapes, and indefinitely multiplied. We shall find them in all religions, even in Christianity, in which Ahriman becomes the prince of devils. But what could the initiates have been told? The modern theosophists who profess to unveil at least a portion of the secret doctrines, by subdividing in a similar fashion the manifestations of the unknown origin, do no more than reproduce in another shape the two facile explanations of exoteric religion, so that they remain as far removed from the source of the enigma as the exoteric doctrine itself. And in the whole domain of occultism we do not find even a shadow of the beginning of an explanation which differs otherwise than in its terms from those of the official religions. We do not know, then, what was revealed to them. And it is likely enough that, just as in the case of the mysterious first cause, they had to be told that no one knew anything. In all probability, it was impossible to tell them anything that the optimistic philosophies of today could not tell us. Namely, that evil does not exist of itself, but only from our point of view. That it is purely relative, that moral evil is but a blindness or a caprice of our judgment, while physical evil is due to a defective organization or an error of sensibility. That the most terrible pain is only pleasure incorrectly interpreted by our nerves, just as the keenest pleasure is already pain. This may be true. But we wretched human beings, and above all the lower animals whose only life is this one, have a right to demand a few supplementary explanations, if, as is only too often the case, this life is merely a tissue of intolerable suffering. The initiated must have been given such explanations. They were referred to reincarnation, to theories of expiation and purification. But these hints, valuable enough if we admit the hypothesis of intelligent gods whose intentions are known, are less defensible when we are dealing with an unknowable cause, to which we cannot attribute intelligence or will without denying that they are unknown. If the adepts were ever given any other explanation, of a nature to impose itself upon them, this explanation should have contained the sovereign key of the enigma. It should have revealed all the mysteries. But not even the shadow of this chimerical key has come down to us. Uncertain though its foundations may be, since they rest only on the unknowable, the fact remains that this primitive religion has handed down to us an incomparable body of doctrine touching the constitution and evolution of the universe, the duration of the transformations of the stars and the earth, time, space, and eternity, the relations between matter and mind, the invisible forces of nature, the probable destiny of mankind, and morality. The esoterism of all the religions, from that of Egypt perhaps, and in any case from those of Persia and Chaldea, and the Greek mysteries, down to the Hermetics of the Middle Ages, benefited by this doctrine, deriving from it the most important and most reliable elements of its prestige, by attributing them to a secret revelation, until the discovery of the sacred books of India made known their actual source and propounded a fresh enigma. Fundamentally, esoterism was never anything more than a more learned cosmogony, a more rational, more majestic, and purer theogony, a loftier morality than that of the vulgar religions. Moreover, it possessed, for the preservation or defense of its doctrines, the secret, painfully transmitted and often terribly obscured, of the manipulation of certain forgotten forces. Today we are able, beneath all its deformations, all its disguises, and all its masks, which are sometimes dreadfully distorted, to recognize the same countenance. From this point of view, it is certain that since the publication and translation of the authentic texts, occultism, as it was still understood scarcely more than 50 years ago, has lost 3/4 of its richest territories. Notably, it has lost almost all doctrinal interest except as a means of verification, since we are now able to learn, at the very source from which it used to flow so grudgingly, all that it used secretly to teach, on the subject of God or the gods, the origin of the world, the immaterial forces which govern it, heaven and hell, as understood by the Jews, Greeks, and Christians, the constitution of the body and the soul, the destiny of the latter, its responsibilities, and its life beyond the tomb. On the other hand, if these ancient and authentic texts, having at last been translated, prove that nearly all the affirmations of occultism, from the doctrinal point of view, were not purely imaginary, but were based on real and immemorial traditions, they permit us likewise to suppose that all its assertions in other respects, and especially with regard to the utilization of certain unknown energies, may be not purely chimerical. And in this way it gains on the one hand what it loses on the other. In fact, while we possess the more important of the sacred books of India, it is almost certain that there are others with which we are not yet acquainted, just as it is highly probable that we have still to fathom the hidden meaning of many of the hieroglyphs. It may therefore be a fact that the occultists became acquainted with these writings or these oral traditions by infiltrations such as those which we have remarked. It would seem that the traces of such infiltrations are perceptible in their biology, their medicine, their chemistry, their physics, their astronomy, and especially in all that touches on the existence of the more or less immaterial entities who appear to live with and around us. In this connection, occultism still retains an interest and deserves an attentive and methodical study which might effectively support and perhaps participate in the investigations which the independent and methodical metapsychists have on their part undertaken in respect of the same subject.